Okay, so part two of this of the content here that's on punk and DIY. I'm going to talk about some of the actual empirical work that I've done with some of the interviews and observations that I've been looking at. So, to begin with, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the conversations I had about the very meaning of what DIY is and what it means to the people in it. So I was kind of talking to them, asking what they thought they were involved in. Is it a community, a scene, a subculture? What are some of the kind of ethics and values of the scene, why that's important, and things like that. And these, again, are kind of relate to those notions of Borgesian struggle, the things that people invest themselves in, and try and, I suppose, in that sense, make the world in their own image and find others that are like themselves. So in terms of what, asking what is DIY, or what is the scene, I think maybe it's something that unites a scene, this DIY notion. So Aspire argues that it's basically extreme music enthusiasts, people that really want to invest themselves in making music, and they're often kind of huge music fans as well, with kind of a deep knowledge of, relatively obscure and niche music histories. He talks about, a particular band there called the Friendsters in Sydney that, people wouldn't know about them unless they are invested in this scene, unless they're obsessed with this music. He calls the scene an obsessed scene. Dax then talks about it, how basically this scene, it's just like everything to the people. People are like fanatical about it and invest their whole lives in it. And then Dax is in a couple of bands that are kind of, really popular in the scene and got a lot of kind of very high critical acclaim. And then so I ask him, is that weird for him that people are now fanatic about his music? And he, says, yeah, sure, but, I'm a fanatic about other music as well, so I get it. When I kind of asked him, what would you call it in these interviews? There's a lot of different musics, as I said before, different sounds. Asp actually said, I think it's a scene. I don't know, because everyone's in these different kind of style of bands, but they play on the same gig lineups, and even though the music's a long way apart, people have the same kind of attitudes. It's not really about musical genre; it's about kind of these kind of attitudes that make up the scene. He says it's simple as just being underground music that's not popular. It's really good music, but it's not on Triple J or mainstream radio. But he says it's really hard to identify what unifies that scene. And what's interesting when you talk to people about, their own practices, particularly creative practices, there's often a kind of reluctance to think about it too critically, because it can be kind of feel like that it's kind of damaging the, motivations to do it. So that you can kind of see some elements of that throughout some of these quotes. So I ask about various kinds of struggles in the scene, and particularly about how it's difficult to kind of make a living out of music. So most of the people that I'm talking to in this research have jobs, sometimes full-time jobs, sometimes part-time jobs, and a lot of them too have multiple creative projects going on. So they'll be in multiple bands. They might have their own little record label where they sell stuff on Bandcamp, or have their own kind of place where they sell artwork and stuff like that, whether that's on Pinterest or something like that. So there's a whole bunch of different activities going on. But yeah, it is increasingly difficult for bands to make money. So there's all kinds of then decisions that need to be made about that. In terms of the punk and DIY label and not selling out and making sure you're doing things ethically, being associated with multinational corporations is obviously a bit of a no-no. The problem being, though, those corporations really want to be associated with bands like these to kind of get some of that punk cred. And this relates to what I also talk in the course about new forms of labour, notions of immaterial labour. This is the idea that kind of, capitalism increasingly makes value and profit out of stuff that we do for free, that we talk about in the course elsewhere. So, he talks about, asking Aspire again, is it a DIY attitude that unites the scene? Definitely, but, not everything he does is DIY. Some of the bands that he's in are not strictly DIY, he says. And you can see here there's a reflexivity going on. There's a kind of inner struggle, both kind of to do the right thing, but also, actually be pragmatic about doing things in day-to-day life. So, for instance, he talks about, it's not strictly DIY, that one of the record labels he's on organises stuff for them sometimes, but, it is a kind of underground label, so that's not too bad. Another band that he was in put out their own record, but then it was like put out in another country by Warner. So again, he said that's not strictly DIY. And then he said another band he was in had a Nike ad or a Nike State video, or he wasn't sure if it was Nike or Adidas. So I asked him about that. I mean, like, you know, surely that's a bit of a problem for a punk to be on a Nike or an Adidas ad. He goes, well, you know, one of the band members was a mate with a person making the video, you know, so you can see here there's crossovers into the creative industries where all these people tend to be living, you know, having fairly precarious economic existence. So any opportunity that comes along needs to be grasped in quite often. So their friend's making this video, an ad for Nike or Adidas or whatever. He knows their mates make music, so he asks them, do they want to be on the video? They get a free pair of shoes, which they all kind of think's a little bit funny. But then, you know, the next time it happens, he says, you know, I don't really want that to happen again. He's kind of thought about it a little bit more. I don't really want to have an association with those things. You'll notice there he also talks about the politics of this. You know, it's obviously that these brands are getting something out of it, but it's not the person who's making the shoes in the sweatshop in Southeast Asia. So again, these are kind of global forces that come into the kind of everyday decisions that these people are making. Talks about, I asked him a little bit further about selling out, and he goes, well, you know, it's not selling out. You know, it's a DIY scene, but like, you know, there's all these kind of things going on that make it little bit more complex than that. And it's also hard when you're in multiple different bands because different people in different bands have different kind of attitudes and different motivations. So even, you know, a time where they play a gig, you know, the band gets paid $200, so they all basically lose money when they do stuff like that. But it's only about the same money if they play at their kind of local kind of punk venues anyway. So there's a kind of rationalisation of that kind of behaviour there, and they, you know, might say yes to a, you know, paid gig by Adidas because it puts them on a bill with other bands that they like and things like that. Again, as he points out, you know, they don't get much out of it, but Adidas gets something out of it here. They get to associate themselves with this kind of underground cool. And again, I'll talk about that later on, of course, in terms of immaterial and effective labours. So what is DIY? You know, I asked them about that, and Dax here is quite eloquent about this. Dax is in a number of bands, again, has his own little record label, and also has run and published a really influential zine in the scene for many years. And I asked him about it, and again, it's not really a sound, it's not a style, it's not a fashion, it's not even a political ideology. But it's more about kind of, he talks about it in terms of a practice. It's a way of doing things. But what he also talks about here is that notion of DIY it's been largely co-opted, and it's been co-opted, he says, by other bands that actually talk about being DIY, but they're absolutely not. And they use DIY, I suppose, as a badge to sell themselves, but really they're just like any other kind of mainstream band. He also talks about how people use it as a kind of leftist politics, but, you know, they don't really practice that stuff. So in that sense, he always saw that being involved in the notion of DIY was about a community, people like-minded commitments, you know, doing stuff together. But he argues that so many people now use it just kind of a badge of credibility and don't really do things themselves, that he's then therefore largely rejected the label these days. He felt that it's been co-opted, so he's just abandoned it. And the example he uses in that quote there is like, one of his bands was nominated for an independent record label award, but when they looked at the other bands on the list, they were the only actual band that was independent. All of them were with relatively, you know, medium to large record labels. So these are the kind of struggles. These sound like kind of small, mundane things to consider, but when you take these things really seriously, they become like big deals in your day-to-day life. And I mentioned this, like, you know, I mentioned that in relation to the notion of illusio again. People invest themselves in all kinds of different things to create meanings, but if you're not interested in it, in fact, if you don't know much about it, sometimes it can look a little bit absurd. And I mentioned this when I was explaining Bourdieu earlier in the course, you know, that, you know, atheists thinks people that invest themselves in religion is silly, and, you know, people from the outside of, say, a goth subculture think the way that they dress is silly and all that kind of stuff. But when you're participating in these things, they actually become, you know, very much about the meaning of life for you. And about, you know, creating an ethical and value, an ethical self that, you know, has value out of the things that you value rather than the things that are other people value. So DIY in this sense becomes a kind of way of thinking about, living your life, but it also gets challenged by outside forces, and that becomes a kind of challenge to the way that people live. So we can think this more broadly in sociological terms, if, about our tastes. Our tastes can be kind of, be inflected with forms of reflexivity sometimes. Where the Borgesian idea kind of largely sees our tastes as being very much associated with our position in social space, which they certainly are. Other theorists argue that this challenges to our tastes, the things we like and don't like, the things we do and don't do, can make us think a little bit about more broadly of the world, and as Hennion says in that quote, understand the way we make ourselves become sensitized to things, to ourselves, to situations and to moments, while simultaneously controlling how those feelings might be shared and discussed with others. Investing yourself in something like this is a way to kind of share your own identity and struggles with other people, and to create a kind of, I suppose, sense of self in many ways. Now, another kind of thing I asked in these interviews was about the rise within the scene of what became known as dollwave, and these bands started to get a lot of attention outside of the scene. There were stories written about them in The Guardian and on all kinds of prominent websites, even things like Rolling Stone magazine and stuff. But there was quite a bit of consternation in the scene about it. So Jimmy Kritzler's, who wrote the book that I was talking about earlier on, Noises in My Head, Voices from the Ugly Australian Underground, which I'll talk about in the third part of the lecture about gender. He talks, about pretty much rejecting this idea. It didn't even come up in terms of his book. He thinks it's ridiculous. I don't think any of the bands can describe themselves as dollwave. But what's interesting, if you then kind of go into it a little bit more detail, some of the bands have a kind of, relatively ambivalent attitude towards that term. I'll go into that more in a minute. If you're interested in checking out, there's a whole list of band camps there that you can check out. Some of those bands, certainly Dick Diver and Twerp, started to get quite a bit of mainstream attention and getting played on Triple J and stuff like that. Both of those bands have now disbanded. What's interesting about this kind of notion of naming and genres is that it kind of is a real indication of how power works. So in music scenes in particular, there's been a whole bunch of really interesting discussions in the past about who named what. These histories are always really contested. The term heavy metal, where did it come from? People argue, was it from the Burroughs novel, or from a Steppenwolf song, or from a story in Rolling Stone? People, argue over who invented the term punk, and there's, various authors of these terms, and twee and grunge and things like that. But in the internet era, so that stuff was happening before things like the internet existed. These genres kind of come and go much more quickly. This is particularly interesting in the kind of era of algorithms and Spotify, when genres in particular are a way of those platforms trying to put more things in front of us to buy, I suppose, that based on the things we're already liked or listened to. So there was a kind of rise of a genre called chillwave in the kind of mid-2000s. This was around some popular bands on the Pitchfork, really influential Pitchfork music internet site, and that was coined by a character called Carles on a kind of parody site called Hipster Runoff. But it actually became a thing, this kind of guy that was taking the piss out of these bands, called them chillwave, but then it actually became a thing that these bands got kind of categorised under. The same things kind of happened with dollwave. The very term itself was just the result of a comment in a discussion board on the now defunct Mess and Noise, but then it became kind of taken up. People laughed about it a bit, joked about it more and more, but it spread out of that message board and became a kind of way of thinking about these bands and categorising them. Another guy tried to do a similar thing and have another bunch of bands called Chillmate, but it never quite took off. So the label sticks, and then all of a sudden there's a discussion about, is this a genre and what's going on there, and if there's a bunch of bands with these sounds and with these kind of lyrical interests, what does it mean, and does it say something about Australia and all this kind of thing? So music journalists started writing about it, but when I say music journalists, I'm talking to begin with of people that were writing on blogs and kind of quite small music websites that were in and around the scene. I'm not here talking about things like the Sydney Morning Herald or the Guardian to begin with. So it's kind of treated like an ironic joke, but the label sticks, and then the bands start getting labelled it more and more. But these kind of social media and blog discussions spring around it, by people that are in the scene. They're kind of passionate about what's going on. They start talking it seriously, others start talking about it jokingly. But then it springs these kind of opinion pieces by people that were writing about the scene within it at the time. Now, importantly here, like the internet, some of these kind of links there will have disappeared, but in the book chapter that's the reading, there's some kind of excerpts out of those opinion pieces that you can look at. These pieces start kind of, almost doing kind of sociological, cultural analysis of the meaning of these bands. What does the term mean? Do these bands kind of actually matter? Are they actually a genre that kind of is saying something interesting about what it means to be a young person in Australia at the moment? What those things are is that many of the lyrics of the band kind of talk about being young, being in precarious situations, struggling to get full-time work, they have lyrics, where they've gone to uni and can't get the full-time job. So, again, you can see here why I'd probably be interested in this genre from a kind of youth transitions perspective, because I think some of the songs that are in this genre do a really good job of articulating some of that. So in terms of, a kind of Borgesian analysis here, we can think about this in terms of what, the power to name means. Bourdieu argues that the power to kind of make the categories are really important in terms of political struggles. Those who get to name things are the ones that get to conserve and transform the social world by conserving or transforming the categories through which it is perceived. So the kind of debate about this is a kind of good example of that. Category struggles and naming here about whether Dole was actually a thing. If it is a thing, what does this discussion even mean? Does Dole Wave actually have a politics? If that politics exists, is it a rejection of the precarity of being a young person in the kind of post-John Howard kind of era in Australia? Is it a reaction against the shift to the right in Australian politics? Or is it an expression of just being apathetic, and therefore the kind of notion of punk has kind of devolved out of this work? Is this a kind of resistance to everyday life, because a lot of the Dole Wave songs celebrate kind of just enjoying the small things, like going to a park and having a few beers with your mates because it's cheap, but it's easy to do, but like there's a kind of strong bond and sociality happening in that situation. There was even some discussion about what class are the Dole Wavers. There was some stuff about some of these kids are middle class, but some of them aren't under the dole, all this kind of stuff about who's authentic, who's in and out. So in the end, these are the kind of the themes and sound of Dole Wave. Is it artistic critique of the world, or is it kind of fatalistic acceptance of it? Again, to get the gist of what's going on there, you should maybe have a listen to some of the songs that I had links to. So from a Borgesian perspective here, the power to nominate is important because it legitimises things or not. Those that kind of get given a label will feel symbolic violence, and some of the band members you'll see in a minute reject the label because they feel it's been imposed upon them. So all symbolic struggles through which agents seek to impose their vision tend to be between two extremes, according to Bourdieu. The everyday insult, where people kind of in their own social situations insult each other or whatever, or more broadly, the official nomination, the way that things like our categories that when we engage with things like Centrelink and stuff like that put us into different categorizations that have a real influence on our day-to-day lives. Bourdieu sketches three levels of the way that the power of the nominate happens. There's the personal, that kind of personal interaction. There's the authorised level, which is kind of can what often look like personal squabbles, maintain a legitimacy. Now this happens in the media all the time. And then there's the state, and the state holds them an official monopoly of naming and classifying and those kind of things. In the examples that I'm talking about here, in terms of the naming of Dole Wave, there's a certain irony going on because they invert the category level of welfare or dole bludger. But it's done at both the individual level in terms of personal conversations and actions, and at the more authorised level, I suppose, in terms of those, bloggers and journalists writing about it. So the struggles over the kind of, how, what this stuff means, I suppose. So I won't go into that slide too much more, and I'll get to the actual data. So I asked about, is Dollwave a thing? And some of these people I was talking to would, had a record label with a few Dollwave bands on it, and some of them were actually in bands called Dollwave. And so, some people say, yeah, it's a thing, it's been written about, so now for it is a thing, but I think, people in the bands don't really subscribe to it. Others say, well, there's an argument whether there's any similarities between these bands to link them to some kind of movement. Some of them aren't actually on the dole. Others talk about how there's kind of accusations about these bands being middle class, but Axel kind of rejects that, because he says that people that accuse people of being middle class are normally middle class themselves, because middle class people are most concerned with calling out other middle class people, which is a particularly interesting point of view, and it's actually, you can see that happening in all kinds of different forms of identity politics. Others talk about, there's some kind of connection here between the lyrics. There's an Australiana thing that maybe produces a kind of new kind of community and a way of thinking about Australia, that kind of has been quite common in the history of Australian rock music, from, Ganga Jang and Midnight Oil and the Go-Betweens and all these kind of, prominent Australian bands. So is it a thing? Some people say yes, some people are not sure, some people say no. So again, there's a struggle within the scene that kind of around this kind of politics of naming. Is Dollwave hipster or bogan, to connect it to earlier parts of the course? Because what happens in Dollwave is there's kind of various kind of symbols going on that, fit into both categories. As one of the commentators under one of the stories about Dollwave said, linking aesthetic interest with a political leaning isn't really a straight line. And the reason for that is that Dollwave has both bogan-esque iconography, VB, drink VB, wearing singlets and flannels, on the dole, singing Aussie accents and stuff like that. But a lot of the production is kind of more hipsterish things, right? They produce records and tapes. They have gigs in warehouses and spaces that aren't really like necessarily mainstream pubs or whatever. They create blog buzz and that kind of thing. So there's a kind of play-off here between new and old media, blogs, Facebook, records, tape, zines. Both are key to production in the scene, and really have a kind of effect on the way people think about the scene. But, then relating them to particular class categories becomes a little bit different. Some of the people in the bands also knowingly play with those icons and symbols as well, as part of the kind of performance that they're doing. So I'm going to leave that section there in terms of the politics of naming, and then move on to thinking about struggles in the scene over some gender things that happened around the Listen Collective and a book.